Hi everyone, it's time for another video. And this one is related to the Civil War as well, not a battle or a campaign. Just like the last video was about an international dispute during the Civil War, this is about some domestic strategy as pertaining to the Civil War, specifically the Emancipation Proclamation. And I know you've all heard of that, and I hope you know the basics of it, but I'm just going to give you some more background stuff on that today. So it was written and given several months before it actually went into effect, as you see there in the dates. And it says the beginning of the new war, because this changed, was sort of a turning point, but also it was a turning point ideologically in the war. We'll get to that here. So what it did, and this is what I think you all know already, it freed all the slaves held in areas designated by the president to be under rebellion. So any state that was rebelling, basically any state in the Confederacy, their slaves were to be thenceforward and forever free. Now, if there were still slaves in Union areas, which there were some, or maybe some of the areas out west, they would not be freed. So it did not free every single slave, but definitely the vast majority of it. And did they actually all be like, "Oh, we're free now," and lived a life of freedom? No, they weren't really released by the Confederacy, but under the Union, they were considered free. So let's take a step back, and we already discussed all the ways in which slavery caused the war and how it increased tensions leading to the Civil War, whether it be the Missouri Compromise, Dred Scott, all those sorts of things. Okay, so there was already legislation dealing with slavery even before the Emancipation Proclamation. So I'm going to give you just one example, and that's the First Confiscation Act, which was given on August 6th of 1861, fairly early in the war. And what this act did is that property, including slaves, right, because they were unfortunately considered property, used to support insurrection against the government, would then be the subject of prize and capture. So they could sort of confiscate the slaves or any property or things used. Slaves were used to doing things, not used to doing this. Slaves were used to do things like build rebel encampments. So even though like slaves weren't fighting really for the Confederacy, they were ordered to do things to help the Confederacy, build the forts or things like that. It did not clarify emancipation. It did not mean that they were all free. It just meant that the Union could sort of confiscate those slaves. Often they were then used to fight for the Union cause. And this began, if you can see this image here, of a case where Confederate slaves were sort of taken by General Benjamin Butler. He was faced with deciding what to do with runaway slaves who appeared at Fort Monroe. That's where Butler was in command. And then he learned that the slaves were used in service for the Confederacy, like building the fort and things. Butler declined to return the slaves to Major Carey, who was basically the slaves' owner, to Colonel Mallory, who was actually sent to retrieve them. He's like, "No, I'm not going to give them to you." Butler offered to return the slaves if Mallory would go to the fort and pledge loyalty to the Union. Of course, Mallory didn't do that. And Butler then declared the slaves to be contraband of war and declined to return them. And he used them, like I said, for the Union cause. Then the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, took Butler's policy and made it like a department policy. And then it becomes even more official with the First Confiscation Act. So that's just sort of what led to it. Now, when you actually read the Emancipation Proclamation, there is some debate over was it constitutional. That's so much a big part of the Civil War. Is secession constitutional? Is the Emancipation Proclamation constitutional? Isn't it abuse of executive powers? Is this something that there could be an executive order for? Does it violate separation of powers or checks and balances? Regardless of this debate, it's really disregarded by the 13th Amendment, which was passed by Congress, which did formally end slavery. The the way it's usually supported is, yes, it was constitutional, is that this was the Civil War. And at this time, the president was commander in chief, and it required extraordinary circumstances. And also, there's this take care clause in the Constitution, which is that the president has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So they say it usually fits under that as well. So the proclamation didn't really have the force to free them. It didn't mean that everyone's going to go down now and say, hey, you have to stop keeping these slaves, right? They weren't actually automatically free. But it did reestablish the principle as to why the war was fought, right? That slavery was a big component of it. It's more what it said than what it did. And what it said angered many Confederate leaders. They didn't like this. Okay, earlier, Lincoln had some different ideas with this. Earlier, he thought that Southern states, if they accepted emancipation voluntarily, they could receive compensation for their loss of property. By this point, that says, hey, you had your chance. That doesn't happen. It also drops the idea of colonization. If you read Lincoln, often he supported the idea that freed blacks should go live in a colony in Africa. And once this happens, he no longer mentions that really ever again. How many slaves were there? When it did come into effect, there were 3.1 million slaves in this area. There were 4 million total. So that's how many, like I said, they didn't really get freed overnight, but technically that's how many would be freed. It also authorized the recruitment of freed slaves and freed blacks as Union soldiers. So now you have a lot of slaves leaving or escaping and joining the Union cause. So over the next 2.5 years, over 180,000 African Americans fought in the Union Army, and another 10,000 in the Navy. This was also largely part of military strategy. It wasn't just about human civil rights. We learned about Secretary of State Seward last homework with the Trent Affair. He persuaded Lincoln to put off the proclamation because timing was important. The Union wasn't doing too well when he wrote it out, and he wanted a major Union victory, and that became Antietam. And then he also used that delay to help gain some support, because not even all the Republicans or not even all the Unionists would support this. And he wrote a letter to Horace Greeley, who was the founder and editor of New York Times, actually spent some time as a congressman himself. And this was published. And this shows you that it's not just about human rights. A lot of it is just about military strategy. Because he wrote, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Lincoln gets a lot of criticism for this idea in time, that it was about the Union, not about really freeing the slaves. But you see how it sort of all ties together. And, there we go. I guess that's all I wrote here. I thought I had another thing on it. But anyway, you see the effect it does ultimately have. You see some of the influences behind it. And eventually the 13th Amendment is what frees all the slaves under the government for forever. This is a big turning point in the war. All right, any more questions? Please let me know, and we'll discuss it next class.